Hope everyone's doing well. I just got back from a week at Esalen, which was interesting. They have this program at Esalen called CTR, Center for Theory and Research, and was started, I think, in maybe the 90s by Michael Murphy. And if you don't know your Esalen lore, like Michael Murphy's family's land makes up Esalen. So it was basically like his family that granted them use of the place in the 60s when they decided to make this Human Potential Center. And before it was a Human Potential Center, it was, the hot springs were there. And I mean, the Native Americans used them, they've been used for a very long time. But before Esalen started, it was like a gay biker bathhouse. And Hunter S. Thompson, for the gonzo journalist, he was the caretaker. So this was before he was well known. So it's already a very interesting place. And, I always like to visit it because it holds like a sort of like a cluster of California energies. Anyway, it's a very interesting institution, and I've been thinking more about it because the Alembic project that I'm involved with is slowly developing. And as some of you may not know, I co-founded the Alembic in Berkeley about a year and a half ago. We opened a little bit less, pretty much like a year. And it's a meditation, movement, visionary culture, creative culture space. We're still kind of making it up as we go along. But one thing that's really clear is how important it is for all of us who founded it to create an anti-guru culture or a critical culture around this stuff. And it's harder. I mean, it's on a certain surface level, it's not that hard to do because you just keep the jerks away. And if somebody is becoming totalitarian, and we haven't had that experience yet, but usually we can just vet people beforehand, so it's not really a problem. But as things get rolling and people, fall in love with teachers, or they get really focused on certain things, it's actually hard, I believe, inside spiritual cultures to really keep it clean. Because not just because of the way teachers fall into their own form of gurudom, but that how students often sort of want the teacher to be a guru. So I've been thinking about Esalen, and it's worth thinking about a little bit, and then maybe I'll come back to the Alembic and then think about how this applies to us. But so when they started the Esalen, it was kind of like, they started having workshops, and it was this so much cultural ferment in the 1960s around this idea of human potentialities. This was a phrase that Aldous Huxley, I believe, was the first one to come up with. The idea that just being human, there are these possibilities and potentials that most of us don't realize or don't even know exist. But that they can be cultivated, nurtured, and begin to bloom. So it's in some ways a secular idea. It's not based on supernatural concepts. You can think about it purely as a psychologically minded person, that we have these possibilities. And indeed, some of the psychology that was influencing them at the time, particularly the psychology of Abraham Maslow, was different than traditional Freudian psychology because it emphasized our potential for higher states. He wasn't naming them in terms of mysticism or Hindu tantra or anything like that. He was just thinking as a psychologist. But whereas Freud and his followers generally focused on all of the conflicts, the repressions, the suffering, and then sort of offered a kind of healing that would, maybe at best get you up to, I think Freud said you could get to sort of ordinary unhappiness was what you could expect out of the deal. And of course, people later on had a slightly less gloomy vision. But Maslow was one of the first to say, hey, once you get your primary needs met, there are some really higher states you can get into: joy, connection, integration. And he used the idea of peak experience. So we heard peak experience. He would talk about the way that these higher states, these positive states, were available to us. And part of the reason one would do Freudian work, or to work with the shadow, work with your conflicts and repression, is to be able to clear the air to get to kind of a higher perspective. And this resonates with a lot of more traditional spiritual views. So that, what you're working on is you inherit these karmic predispositions and patterns, maybe from your culture, maybe from just the nature of human being, but that one is able to see through them, work with them, digest them, metabolize them, break them down. There's a lot of different ways of talking about it, but then getting things out of the way, something more full and rich and realized and peaceful and beautiful would emerge. So kind of inevitably, even though in a lot of ways, Esalen started on this kind of secular tip, inevitably there was a kind of religious dimension as well. But one of the key things that happened as the place evolved and they developed different psychological regimes is that there were always factions there. And this was actually almost part of the point. And the great phrase that Michael Murphy used to talk about Esalen was that nobody captures the flag. So it's an interesting situation because is sometimes very conflictual. There were big personalities. They disagreed about the best way to do therapy or human potential, and they would, struggle even on an institutional level. And there were sometimes that the institution, almost ground to a halt. And it's kind of amazing that it's still there. And for a while, I thought, oh, it's still there just because, like, Michael Murphy's still alive. He's 93. He was at this event that I was just at, which I'll talk a little bit about. In a way, he's kind of keeping it together. And it will be very interesting because, he won't be around forever, and it will be interesting to see what happens. But somehow, they were able to create a sense of continuity even amidst all of this kind of differentiation, because it's been a very, very influential place. The kind of public view of it is sort of the typical New Yorker, New York Times kind of view of it being a place of indulgence and silly new age ideas and goofy California stuff. And it is true that it has gotten very expensive. So the people who are there for the most part are pretty well heeled. And it definitely changes the vibe a lot. A few years ago, they, partly because of COVID, partly because of these real financial constraints, and partly because they just wanted or thought they needed to do it, they got rid of a lot of folks there. So a lot of the kind of old school soul hippie hangers-on are gone. So it has this kind of a strange vibe in some ways, but it's still a very, very beautiful place. And it's quite striking because it kind of, what I like about Esalen is that one of the things I like about it is that it incarnates geographically a certain condition that I associate with California. And I mean, one of those is just the fact that it was an Indian grounds that then get seized and covered with settler colonialist culture. The house, which was built in the 1930s by Michael Murphy's family, where we had this gathering, is built on top of a graveyard. And, he talked about that. But on another level, you have, of course, all the geothermal activity and all the grinding plates and, a sense of dynamics in the ground that lead to having hot springs. That's where you have hot springs. There's always some kind of geothermal grinding dynamic earth energy. But the other thing I'm thinking about is that it sits kind of on a very steep mountainside at the bottom near the ocean, on cliffs above this ocean, but that underneath the water it keeps going down so that it becomes very deep very fast. So just a couple of 100 meters off the coast, it gets really deep. So there's a kind of fierce quality to the space, a sort of intensity. It's not mellow. It's very hedonistic in a way, and it certainly has been in the past, with the baths and the groovy, find yourself and all this kind of thing. But it's actually kind of a striking end of the world kind of feeling, meaning like end of the edge, or edge of the world, I should say. And there's a book by a Jesuit, really smart Jesuit, called about Esalen, called Looking West from California's Shores. And there's this kind of sense of the end of the roadness of it. And that's sort of the way I put it into a kind of bigger story that I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is, whether you want to think about it spiritually or whether you want to think about it in terms of, a more secular view without a religious component, there's something about the reaching the end of the human, or at least reaching the end of a certain story about the human, that I think California stages, both literally in the sense that it's helped to engineer our sort of proto-post-human reality more than most places on the planet, but also almost kind of mythically, where it's like literally the end of the West, and it's the place where people go to transform. But what are they transforming into? And it's the place where you go, where Western civilization, so to speak, goes until it hits the largest ocean on the planet in these deep ridges, and there's nowhere to go. So where do you go? And in California's answer to that is like, you go into media, you go into space, because the aerospace museum industry here was enormous. We don't think about it so much as we think about Silicon Valley or Hollywood, but it's equally important. And even back to the 19th century, some of the best observatories were here until the middle of the 20th century. So even that sort of scientific exploration of the cosmos, there's something about this place that's part of the story. And all of these things are kind of weirdly like, how the West tells its story about where it's going when it doesn't know where it's going anymore. And I think Silicon Valley also has its own kind of answer to that question, instead of just, there's so many things we could talk about: computers and the destiny of computing and the destiny of the digital. But one is to kind of like break reality as it is and offer and even kind of produce a sort of wormhole in conventional space-time that begins to sort of suck all this energy into it, and that we're sort of partway down this process of translation into some kind of virtual or, highly digitized or layered reality, where like actual objects in space-time are overlaid with digital figures. And there's just the kind of sense of vertigo that I think we can all sense a little bit about our digital lives, at least I do. So in a way, Esalen is kind of one answer to this conundrum, which is not a typically religious answer, but it is one that embraces human potential, the possibilities of the human body mind, and then just experiments and explores in a myriad of directions, some of which are ridiculous, some of which are sublime, some of which are intellectually very coherent, some of which are stupid. But it represents this kind, in a way, it kind of concretizes in a particular place this desire to maintain the freedom of that we kind of fantasize about as a California value, an American value, a Western value, sometimes to our own detriment, but a quality of freedom of not submitting to religious authority. But along with that, there's almost inevitably not just a kind of conflict about what the way to go is, but also a certain existential struggle. One woman I spoke to was very smart. We did, so anyway, the CTR gatherings are a set of gatherings that Michael Murphy started in the 90s, as I mentioned. And initially, they were focused on evidence for life after death. So basically, they were a place where, you know, scientists, paranormal researchers, intellectuals who were very interested in things that were otherwise completely forbidden from the typical academic or university world were able to come together and really research and share their findings and kind of build a sense of camaraderie. So there was a lot of that. And for many years, they were mostly focused on a lot of psi phenomena and evidence of life after death, reincarnation, a lot of things like that. And then at a certain point, partly because of various personnel changes, they became a little bit more like university humanistic research, but with always a bent towards the paranormal and the bizarre. Some of you know who Jeff Kripal is. He's a wonderful author. He's a historian of religion. He was my PhD advisor, and he's a very wacky character who is fascinated by UFOs and the paranormal and precognition and all this weird shit that they don't usually let you talk about in the university. And somehow he's managed to do it, partly because his books are very charming and witty, and I really recommend them if you're interested in these kinds of topics. He's a great writer and quite persuasive. I just read a short book by him that came out a couple of years ago called The Flip. And this one was really good. It's a nice, short, kind of like why you should keep your mind open towards paranormal possibilities. And he mostly just focuses on the theories and experiences of scientists or people who are trained as scientists, and then who go through what he calls the flip, where a typical scientific materialist worldview is no longer supportable, either because of your own experience or because of how you started to think about the world in a new way. And then they flip and you become, usually you accept some version of mind, of irreducible mind. That however we want to think about the physical universe, there's something in mind that is not reducible to squirmy little meat stuff. And there's different ways of doing this, and he discusses some of them. But it's really kind of one of the underlying sort of motives of CTR, but in a way, kind of Esalen in general. How do we think about this mind? And in a way, it's easier to be religious once you move outside the secular materialist framework. Because, and this is partly, I think, why religion we're seeing a resurgence of religion, not just in the United States, but all over, is that, except for maybe Europe, is that it gives you a very crisp way of navigating this moment, because you can see that, the modern world with its secular materialism is fundamentally wrong, or it's fundamentally missing something about reality. And so that creates a kind of crisis of authority, because the scientists are no longer in control. They don't know what's going on. The university professors aren't in control. They don't know what's going on. But over here, I have a system of faith, an institution, maybe one that's been around for thousands of years, and that will provide answers for me so I can relieve myself of some of the anxiety of not knowing what's going on, but no longer trusting the typical worldview that underlies the New York Times or Scientific American or whatever. Although if you read those things closely, particularly Scientific American, you see that it's actually more complicated story than the one I'm saying. But I still think it's valuable to stay on this kind of level. But a place like Esalen, and I think in some sense the kind of work that we do and the kind of conversations we have, and certainly the kinds of things we're doing at the Alembic, is this kind of blend or mixture where we maintain some of the features of secular modernity, the importance of individual freedom, or at least the capacity of groups of people to come up to determine their own experiments with living. The idea with experimenting with the situation that we're in is of vital importance, that we don't know in advance. The tradition can't answer a lot of our questions. And that we're in some sense kind of both individually and collectively making it up as we go along. And you have those kind of elements, except rather than just go towards making more money or making better technology or making, even making culture that is successful, we're moving towards an engagement with spirit. I'll just leave it undefined for now. Some sense that there's more than the secular materialist framework, and that practices, experiences, psychedelics, deep reading, deep reflection, love, nature are all potential spaces to discover this something more. And I think a lot of us, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, or definitely there's a kind of hollowness or dissatisfaction with a lot of the typical material goals that people have. But it's not enough just to be an outsider, just to be a rebel, just to be a bohemian, that there's a draw towards something that may require discipline, that may require challenging degrees of honesty, that may require radical courage in ways that we're not aware of, that may require us to look at ourselves in very different ways, maybe very difficult ways, because we have to kind of reckon with some of the ways in which we have not been serving our best interests or the best interests of those around us. And then there's a kind of reckoning with the self that can be very difficult. But there's an additional difficulty for those of us who are still in the no one captures the flag world, that religious believers mostly don't have, which is that we kind of still have the existential question at the heart of it. There was a woman that I met at Esalen, who, again, we did one public event. So all the people who were there for all the other programs, CTR is kind of in its own little world, but we do a public event on Wednesday when everyone gave a little short talk, and I talked about the value of humanities for entheogenic culture. This was something that was the theme of our gathering. It was mostly academics and scholars, but people who were very interested in entheogens, not just psychedelics, but also mind expanding practices, and found them to be really key, a significant key to understand culture and history. So we were presenting these ideas, and this woman asked some very intelligent questions, and we chatted afterwards. And at one point, almost in a casual way, she just kind of gestured towards the fact that it's really hard not to know what's going on, especially when you kind of enter into this space. Because what do? Do you do internal family systems? Do you do this? Do you do that? What do? You see there's a problem. You feel there's a problem. There's something missing. There's something broken. There's something frustrating. And in my case, I could say, well, I know that I have the capacity to experience great, sublime spiritual joy, partly through practices, partly through dancing at concerts, partly through love or nature or whatever. But there's something like non-sustaining about it. And a lot of the time, I'm just aware of the kind of wreckage or the challenge. But what do you do? Where do you go? Who's going to tell you? And if you're in a religious situation or a cult situation, then part of the attraction of that is because somebody else knows. And you're just like, okay, here we go. That's what we're doing now. We're doing this thing. We're like, this is what we're doing. Blah, 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 blah. And even when you're a seeker and you don't know, and you find something that works, if you're paying attention to yourself, just the way when we fall in love, you fall in love, and that's a great experience. It can be very powerful, it can be very mystical. But we also often hose ourselves because like, oh, this person's the one. They're going to give me this, and it works out, and we get along this way, and we all have the same interests, and whatever the story is about, like even though that's not the way it's going to be, even though you looked at every relationship you've known and you've seen the cracks and the challenges, especially over time, you've seen your own parents, you've seen it all, that, but yet there's another party that's like, this is the one. So we have this stitched in, this is the one kind of thing. And in a way, spiritual traditions and paths, I'm sure some of us have gotten really deep into certain paths and then come out, sometimes happily, sometimes like, what the fuck was that? Others of us probably stay on the edge, like there's things, nothing really quite seems to work. It doesn't quite resonate. You don't really trust it. And in either case, there's this kind of sense of moving inside and outside of things. And indeed, I think the love affair is a good analogy for the ways in which we can engage with certain traditions and certain practices, as long as we're being smart about it, meaning that it's fine to fall in love. It's wonderful to fall in love. And sometimes we meet teachers that we fall in love with. And I don't mean in an erotic way necessarily. I just mean that, we're possessed. Wow, this is it. I'm going to go for this. And then it doesn't last. We see cracks, we get disappointed. And then there's this interesting space where you're kind of disappointed. You see some of the fundamental flaws. And some people are like, that's it, I'm out of here. And then you go searching again. And there you are, being a seeker once again, even though you know that it's probably your seeking as much as anything else that keeps you from feeling realized and at peace and content with the human experience. Or in a deep way, not just content, like, well, I guess I'm content. No, I mean, like, where you're really, this is it, and this is all, and that's enough. Like, instead, we're always kind of seeking. So some people, they bag and they leave, and others are like, well, I'll stick around because, it's still pretty good, but there's problems, So that's kind of this, no one captures the flag. That's the sort of secret challenge. It sounds good. We're anti-cult. We don't believe in, we don't like the cult behavior. We don't like the mind control, and we don't. I'm not interested in people who claim to know and thereby draw in other people who can't handle, for good reason, the anxiety of not knowing, and really want to turn to somebody who knows. It's very satisfying. I've spent some time doing that. And I think in some ways we do that. It's just that meaning that sometimes it's good to be around people who know how to do certain things. I mean, like sometimes our teachers, they know very much how to do certain practices, or people are very sophisticated psychologically and they know how to go through certain issues that we're flailing with, just like people know how to cook or they know how to garden. But the problem with the spiritual master is that they are tempted to know everything, and students are often tempted to have them know everything. And so that's what's really important to resist. And I think one of the challenges of the whole growth of alternative religion in the 60s and 70s, the kind of stuff that people were exploring at Esalen in a kind of hedonistic vein in many ways, is that it has this kind of existential conundrum at the heart of it. It has this sort of problem of not knowing, and of kind of drifting or being ungrounded or being unrooted. So that's part of the draw towards tradition and part of the draw towards cults. It's one of the reasons cults exploded in the 1970s and 80s, was because people were so blown open by their experiments and experiences in the 60s that they just couldn't hack it. You can't go back. You can't go back to Nixon's America. but you can't go forward. Where are we going? There's nowhere to go. People are, what? Who am I? Where am I? That kind of pressure can be very, very strong, very, very difficult. And so I think we're in a real tricky spot, because it's not enough just to be a solo seeker and just make it up as you go along. I mean, some people can do that well, but most of us need some kind of community, and we need some kind of teacher, we need some kind of connection. But how do we do that in a healthy way, in a way that still supports our own independence and our own seeking and our own inquiry? And so I've always been drawn towards groups or teachers that stress kind of an inquiry process, or that stress practice kind of almost for its own sake, not practice as a means towards this thing you're going to get, and then everybody's on the same path together, but more like, no, just keep practicing, keep sitting, keep doing yoga, just keep it rolling. Doesn't mean you don't get caught up in it, and indeed you can look around you and you see people doing it left and right. But I think it's a real challenge that we're going through, and so I see that at the Alembic, where you're like, well, how do we deal with the fact that, like, some of these teachers, like, their worldviews don't agree with each other at all, and some teachers show up and they can kind of sniff out that we're not, even if they're not super totalitarian, they kind of know. They're like some Vipassana person, like, they know that everything else is kind of bullshit. And like, if you're really going to do it, you're going to do Vipassana this way. And we're like, that's fine. You can teach here, because we trust, or we would like to believe, that the culture of the place is encouraging people to, go and expose themselves to different things, find out what works. And sometimes it's okay being with a teacher who's very doctrinaire about certain things, because you learn more. You sometimes you're in a pressure cooker and you go through that experience. I mean, I've even met people who would say, yeah, this one guy, this poet named Sparrow, I might have told the story before, but he said, when I first met him, I was like, hey, yeah, where are you coming from? And he goes, well, we were talking about the 70s. He goes, my wife and I spent the 70s in cults. And I was in a Hindu cult, she was in a sex cult. It was kind of fun, and it's like, meaning that it's like a theater of possibility, that because it's super intense, and because there's this extraordinary charismatic power of not just necessarily the teacher, but even just the school or the group, or the power of what they were doing, that it's like a pressure cooker. So you can go in there and it's super intense, and a lot gets metabolized, and some people have extraordinary experiences. Some people become addicted to the scene. Some people get crushed. It's sort of like extreme sports in a way, like they're extreme socio-theatrical, mystical sports to set up a cult and say, well, this looks a little weird, but I'm going to go and check it out. I'm going to go up to Rajneeshpuram in Oregon and hang out with the Bhagwan. I mean, who knows what's going to happen, So I even kind of appreciate the move. It's not the one that I'm interested in making or fomenting, but people can even tell, like, some of these teachers, they're like, oh yeah, this isn't going to work for us. Yeah, I think I'm not going to do this, because they can smell the no one captures the flag principle. Anyway, I have no way of wrapping up this particular issue. I just experience it as part of what we are wrestling with, that the not knowing and the sense of even drifting, or having to work to find your way to a practice, is kind of part of the cost of keeping it free and open. And that one of the really important ways to mitigate against authoritarian teaching situations is precisely to have a strong emphasis on, community is kind of a lame term, on peer-to-peer relationship, on spiritual friends, people who may go along different paths, but are able to speak deeply, and even to some degree to call each other out a little bit. Like, yeah, you're getting, like, one of my good spiritual friends, he got a little inflated at one point, and I was like, no, man, you can't. No, you're not the guru. He got in one. And then I've been like stuck in certain ruts, and he's like, are you sure come on, come on, come on. So there's a way in which one of the answers to this problem, which in a way is a good problem to have, is to develop richer horizontal relationships, which is not always as emphasized in spiritual stuff, because there's so much of an emphasis on kind of transmission or the relationship to the teacher. So a lot of vertical things. And the horizontal one, even though it's like we all don't know together, something happens from our conversation and our communication, sharing notes, sharing insights, sharing intuitions, that I think balances some of the other tendencies that we see. And it's really important. And it's really important right now, because I think that in many ways, and maybe I'll end here, I've been going on a little long, that some of the conditions of our contemporary moment, the sense of anxiety and fear, the way in which digital communication is transforming, and the increasing collapse of conventional forms of authority, which has been going on for decades, arguably the whole 20th century. But I think it's more palpable now that in a culture of narcissism and self-entrepreneurship, that the opportunities for the kinds of authoritarian positions that we associate with cults are quite open, rampant. And I don't quite see it yet, because, in a way, the openness of the internet or the flow of information makes it more difficult to do some of the classic cult moves, which is to isolate your followers and to say, oh, you can't communicate with anybody and you can't read any news. You just got to come in here. And that's become much harder to do. So there are some things about the moment that mitigate against it. But on the other hand, I think there are other aspects that mitigate, that support it. And indeed, part of the growth of fascism or totalitarianism or right-wing populism, or however you want to call it, and there's multiple things. Part of what we're seeing, I believe, has to do with these changing conditions. Yes, let's abduct ourselves. Or like I used to think about Burning Man, I'd say, it's a self-service cult. Wash your own brain. And in a way it's funny, but it's also kind of this weird situation we're in. And if we're gonna not feel so isolated that we start to get a sense of craziness, then we have to figure out ways to maintain connections in rich and robust ways. Anyway, this is a lot of, I didn't really know what I was going to talk about tonight, so I just started talking about Esalen, and this is where I wound up. Even though normally I'll do the sitting now, just because I raise a lot of issues that might be potent for people. If anybody has any burning comments or questions now, we could take them. And if not, we can just do the sit and talk about it later. But I just wanted to open up that possibility. Looks like everybody's groovy for now. That's fine. We can wait. I just wanted to make sure that if there was anything burning, we could get to it. So let's do a little meditating. Find your seat. I always think it's important, if you're sitting in a chair, to not have your back leaning fully against the chair, but if you need to, that's fine. But I think that sense of uprightness in the spine is really key. So even if you're sitting in a chair, but certainly if you're sitting on the ground, have the hips sort of falling forward a bit so that your spine can rest with a little curve at the lower back and balance itself. Allow your limbs and to settle, shake it off a little bit. we're going to be going for a deep sense of relaxation. So just settle in for a moment and feel where you are. How does your body feel? How does your mind feel? No judgment. You're not changing anything. Just really feel into where you're at right now. You can sense into the breath. The breath is going to be our vehicle for relaxing and opening tonight. So first, just encounter your breath where it's most available. It might be coming through your nose, the whole course of the breath, through your body, or if there's a certain place you like to focus in, but just allow that process to settle and open up. One thing to note is on the inhale, there's often a little sense of energy or energizing. You're drawing in kind of sparkly light from the outside into your body, a kind of cooling, refreshing breeze. And on the out breath, there's more a sense of warmth and wetness coming up from the body back into the world. So as you use the breath or follow the breath into a deeper sense of relaxation, note those subtle differences. The way the in-breath feels, the way the out-breath feels. Perhaps a sense of energy or coolness or sparkliness on the inhale, and a sense of warmth and melting and deeper relaxation on the exhale. So let's stay with that for a few minutes. You may find that the exhale can help you relax and stay open through its very warmth, through its sense of melting. So if you have stresses in the body, restless feelings, you can allow them to sort of melt into the exhale. You find yourself drifting, you not only just return your mind gently to the breath, but use the breath to melt away the restless mind. If you're having any trouble understanding what I mean, you can slightly constrict your exhale, just ever so slightly, the smallest amount you can. And that sometimes makes the dynamic more available. Kind of gentle yogic breathing that allows the breath to become a kind of crucible. So as you relax, make sure to stay in touch with a basic sense of awakeness, a kind of crisp presence. This isn't something you have to add, but it's a way of directing the relaxation so that what you're opening into as you relax is this basic sense of crisp awareness. It's as if the pond, as it settles down, its ripples begin to rest, only becomes brighter, more able to reflect the night sky. Now really stay with this sense of relaxing. Again, we may have stresses in our bodies, pains or tensions, tightness. And this is a great opportunity to practice relaxing, which of course you can't force. You simply open your fist, so to speak. You open and release. But with these physical things, you can really note the quality of mind that accompanies that release. Not forcing, not simply wishing, but actively relaxing. Just as we are relaxing our bodies, there's a lot else that can be relaxed as well. Our chatter, of course, but even as the words and the thoughts begin to calm down, we might see other elements of the mind that are asking to relax as well. One of these that you could take a look at is your basic sense of self, your I-ness. You might feel it in a part of your body. You might sense it as the agent of all these thoughts that come and go. You might sense a kind of mind behind your mind, watching, observing, even making decisions. But the point is not to force this powerful, ancient sense to disappear by fully relaxing it. It's to see what happens as you invite it into the relaxation process. See how far it goes, where it stops, and then just be still and accepting with wherever it is. It's like relaxing to the point you can't relax anymore and relaxing into that. So try that. Where is that sense of self most salient for you now? And see if you can release it, and where you can and where you can't, and just create relaxation around that very difficult process. Sometimes we can key into this self sense by paying attention to our gaze. Even if our eyes are closed, there's a sort of presence behind the gaze that seems to be us. Can I relax that feeling? Sometimes I can sense that self as it appears in my thoughts. I have a memory, some event, some impression, and it comes packaged with a person that it happened to. So even as your thoughts come and go, they also provide the opportunity to get contact with this sense of self. And then as you relax the thinking, relaxing that sense as well. By offering something difficult like this, part of the lesson is to learn to relax about not being able to relax. This is a powerful lesson. To not stress when you hit the wall. Another place this self-sense arises is in our bodies. That the feel of being a living body, being in a living body, is the ground of our I. So what I want you to do is, as we continue to breathe, and if it's available and it works, continuing to use the exhale in particular as a vehicle of relaxing, see what happens if you relax the boundary around your body. And a lot of this relaxing, or a lot of this boundary, I should say, is really just an idea you have about where your body starts and stops. That as you relax the sense of boundary, allow your focus to be in the actual feelings of your body, your legs, your arms, the surface of your body, and be very clear about what you're actually feeling. And you may begin to notice how the sense of a boundary, this bright cartoon line around yourself, just isn't really there, or at least not the way you thought. So sneak up on the feeling of a bounded body and relax that sense of a boundary. If you feel, say, the surface of your skin against your clothes, that might seem like a good indication of a boundary, but go into that sensation. What is it actually composed of? Something fuzzier, perhaps, more like an energy than an object. So as you feel into this melting boundary, allow yourself at times to reflect on, who am I? Or where am I? Depending on how relaxed you are, this question may inspire a return to a familiar feeling, like I'm that vague thinking thing behind my eyeballs that's located in the center of my skull. But you can now perhaps glimpse it, see that process more clearly as you move from this fuzzy boundary to that familiar self. Or perhaps it doesn't appear that way for now. and the self as a different character. Less defined, more pervasive. So let's play with that a bit more. Draw attention to the sense of a boundary around your body. Really lean into it. Allow your ideas to relax. Go into the sensation. And then when the time is right, ask, where am I? And see what happens. It may sound like the most natural thing in the world, but the idea that I am in here on this side of the boundary, and out there is the world that is not me, seems perfectly normal. But from some perspectives, it's just an idea. And as you work at this boundary, you may be able to glimpse the way that this idea returns in order to organize your experience in a familiar way. And that's the process that will be our final object of relaxing. So as you ask, where am I? Who am I? I'm in here, it's out there. That is an overlay that can be relaxed. Finally, allow that sense of a porous boundary to really pervade the space you're in, almost as if you're bringing your consciousness, your I-ness, melting it through your body, releasing it through the boundary, and really, as much as you can, or as much as it appears, feel the identity of your awareness and this pervasive field we find ourselves in. If that doesn't come, no big deal. Just melt your awareness into the space. Sights and sounds and feelings aren't coming from out there or in here. They're just arising in pervading mind. In a moment, we will end. When we do, notice what happens as you open your eyes and reorient. See if you can catch, just for a second, a glimpse of that organizing process through which we settle ourselves in our bodies, in a world outside of ourselves. So with that, let's end the meditation.